Today, Alexandra, Drake, and I are going to be presenting about the Edwards Trinity Aquifer System located in Texas. The image on the right shows a typical cross-section of what you would see with the Edwards Aquifer. It is associated with early Cretaceous age limestones overlying the Glen Rose limestone formation and underlying the Del Rio clay formation. It is confined on the bottom and top by the Glen Rose and Del Rio formations, respectively. So you were looking at recharge areas on the left of the diagram, and the brown colored areas represent relatively impermeable rock. These are some of your confining layers. The Edwards limestone has a thickness of roughly 450 to 500 feet, which about 450 feet make up the Edwards Aquifer. There are lateral boundaries to the east near Kyle in Hayes County, and to the west near Brackettville in Kenny County. It is bounded to the south by a line called the Bad Water Line, which marks where water has more than 1,000 milligrams per liter total dissolved solids. Finally, it is bounded on the north by the northern edge of the Belcones Fault Zone. The limestones associated with the Edwards Aquifer were deposited as shallow marine platform carbonates. They were then subject to subaerial exposure, which in return enhanced the development of the secondary porosity. However, the porosity and permeability of the confined freshwater part of the Edwards Aquifer results primarily from the calcification of, of dolomitic rocks by circulating calcium-rich groundwater. In the unconfined portion of the aquifer, the permeability is characterized by dissolution of limestone by circulating groundwater, which led by the development of cavernous network along fractures associated with the Edwards Formation. The image shows what to expect these cavernous networks to look like. Here's another cross-sectional diagram giving us more of a horizontal view of what's going on in the Edwards Aquifer. The aquifer is primarily recharged by streams, rivers, and that originate from the Edwards Plateau. Three main river basins cross over the area: the San Antonio, the Guadalupe, and the Nueces River. All of the streams and rivers, except for the Guadalupe River, which cross over the Edwards Aquifer, lose a substantial amount of water flow to the aquifer through joints, faults, and sinkholes. We can also get a good depiction of what the southern boundary of the aquifer looks like, the Bad Water Line in this image here. United States Geological Survey estimates suggest that the aquifer has an average annual recharge rate of 651,700 acre feet, with roughly 88.5% coming from the Nueces River Basin. In general, the water travels to the south-southeast from the recharge zone. It travels through steep hydraulic gradients with relatively low permeability levels. It then begins to shift directions as it starts to interfere with the southern boundary. Regional flow of water within the aquifer is then generally from west to east. Fun little postcard shown in this image shows the old Texas gusher in San Antonio around 1900. Flowing Edwards artesian wells and springs do exist where pressure is high enough to force water out of the ground. Although for most Edwards wells nowadays, there's no longer sufficient hydraulic pressure to force water all the way to the surface due to pumping of the well. Major natural discharge from Edwards Aquifer can be found at the San Marcos and Como Springs to the northeast. And next, I'm going to pass it over to Alexandra, and she will go over the next topic.
Okay, so I'm going to go into a little more detail about the formation of the aquifer system. So it originated in the Paleozoic era, so about 500, 600 million years ago. And what today is the Gulf of Mexico, it was a mountainous region. And there was a shoreline that cut through present-day Texas in a southwest-northeast fashion. And this separated the land from the sea that was to the northwest. And the sediments came down those mountainous areas and deposited along the shoreline. Then about 200 million years ago in the Mesozoic, particularly in the Jurassic, Texas rose higher than the Gulf of Mexico, and that region began to sink. So there was a swap between the wet and dry land, and they're not actually too sure why this happened or how it happened, but it was some sort of tectonic activity. And because of this oscillation of the shoreline, there were times when the limestone was exposed and then times when it was covered by water. But when the limestone was exposed, it also experienced erosion from the air. And then in the years following, there was volcanism in the Pacific coast of Mexico that contributed to a layer of clay, and that formed over the eroded limestone, and that was called the Del Rio clay. And this just acted as the confining unit for the aquifer. After that, there were thinner layers of limestone that deposited on top of the Del Rio clay. And I'm going to pass it over to Drake.
All right, hi everyone, I'm Drake, and I'm going to be talking about more of the human aspect of the aquifer. And when humans are involved, contamination and pollution isn't far to follow. So one big thing that a lot of people are worried about, especially Texans, are the increased urbanization and massive boost in population. The picture down here I have shows, it's a little blurry, but the darker regions show very large populations growth just within the year. And I think, if I remember the study correctly, they said by 2040, Texas's total population will have doubled, which is a lot. Now, the reason this is a problem is because Texas has been ready for the contamination that comes from humans, such as pesticides and the chemicals I have here, but they're not quite ready for the amount. So all the systems that they currently have in place will fall apart when more people are involved. A lot of people are worried about this. And one thing that they can see that has already started to fall apart are their sewage systems. I think just in this past year, there were 2 sewage leaks, which is kind of weird. You don't usually have leaks, but there were 2 major sewage leaks. And as more people come into these areas that were usually less populated, the sewage systems will just break down more and more. And then I put there just to emphasize my point, this only gets worse, doesn't get better. We can go to the next slide. All right, so overpumping was also a large issue, and they've noticed since 1995, they were like, wow, our water levels are dropping. We should probably do something about that. And they did, but you can't do too much. Now, the reason I say this is because they still have a bunch of farms in Texas, and we talked about this last week a little bit, or we touched on it, I should say, how when you try and grow things in a desert, it requires a lot of water. Similar to California, how we have a lot of farms here, but it's hard to grow things in a desert a lot of the time. So you require massive amounts of water. And here you can see how much of the water is actually used on irrigation just from their usual discharge. And so that's kind of a problem. And you also see how industrial and your everyday has a pretty low amount. But if the population doubles, the rate of overpump will increase as well. And if we finish off on the last slide here. So there's a big problem in Texas, and there's a big battle for water. And water hustlers are people who are taking advantage of Texas's rule called the rule of capture. Now, what this essentially says is that if your land is on top of a source of groundwater, feel free to pump away as much as you want. And we talked about this earlier, how the pressure in the system has gone down, and this is a major factor because what ends up happening is if your neighbor and you are both tapped into the same aquifer, you're just going to dig the deepest well possible and pump as much as you can, because if you don't, the guy next to you is going to pump as much as he can. And this leads to wells running dry all across Texas. And so you might be thinking, well, why aren't they doing anything to stop this? And they tried. Someone whose well went dry brought this before the Texas Supreme Court, and most people expecting them to put in regulation, they didn't. They kind of just said, well, that's just how it happens, and we'll wait for Texas government to see if they want to do anything. And if they never do anything, we'll step in when it's absolutely necessary, which is not a great philosophy to have when talking about the future of your water sustainability. Down here was just a fun little picture I found from old times where this dude is just pumping excess of water because he doesn't care. Why would he not pump it when his neighbor might pump it? And then I'm going to pass it back to Alexandra to talk about some wildlife.
All right, so just to add a different point of view to this, there are over 40 species known to reside in the Edwards Aquifer, 7 of which are endangered, and one of these species is also classified as threatened. And most of the decline of these species is attributed to a decrease in spring flow. And that decrease happens because of the overpumping and the destruction of land, which is happening because of the increase in agriculture, as well as the expansion of the residential areas because of the aquifer. And another reason for the decline is because of the pollution in the groundwater. So there are a few contributing factors to the decline of these species. And some of the endangered species include the San Marcos gambusia, which is pictured on the bottom left. And this little guy actually hasn't been seen since 1982, so people already believe that it's extinct. On the bottom right is Texas wild rice, which is also an endangered species in this aquifer system, so plants are included in this. And on the top is our threatened species. It's the San Marcos salamander. It's about 6 centimeters long. And all these organisms range from about 5 inches to almost microscopic. You have really, really small ones. And because they're so small, they're very sensitive to even the smallest changes in temperature, for example. And the temperature can vary based on the changes in water flow or even with changes in turbidity within the aquifer system. And those changes happen because of the pumping, because of all the pollution, everything being used from the aquifer. So not only are these changes in the aquifer affecting human life, but it's also affecting life native to the aquifer. Right, and from there, does anyone have any questions?